I'm going to be talking to Stewart Prest, who's a political science professor at Simon Fraser University, about a CBC op-ed he wrote titled "Attacking Opponents as Socialists and Dictators Weakens the Fabric of Our Democracy." Welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I gather you've had some pointed responses to your op-ed.
That's fair to say. They came in pretty quickly. I went live early this morning and I had an email from at least one reader before I had my first cup of coffee for the day. So there's been a steady trickle of them ever since.
And are they taking you to task or agreeing?
So there's a fair amount of agreement for sure. There is a real concern, and I think this is where the article is trying to go with the seeming legitimization of delegitimizing language, if you want to put it that way, where we get used to calling our political opponents by these illegitimate names. And there's a fair amount of criticism too, and the criticism comes in a couple of different directions. Some is fairly expected, and some of it is a bit surprising. But the key point that people are pushing back on is whether I'm essentially being one-sided, if I'm essentially avoiding an equivalence between what we see on the left and on the right. And so I think there are different ways to respond to it. There's certainly a need to be careful for delegitimizing language on either side of this political polarization that we see. But I think it's also important not to pretend everything is always equal either.
Right. Well, let's get into your argument. Basically, as I understand it, you're arguing that if you call if you call Prime Minister Trudeau a dictator, or if you call your opponents socialists, and you do that on a regular basis, I mean, you're trying to delegitimize them in a way because, for the most part, those labels are not accurate.
Right. And so the dictator one is the most cut and dry. The Prime Minister of Canada is not a dictator. We have a high degree of centralization in the country, and it's great to have conversations about that, whether we have too much power concentrated in the executive and the office of the Prime Minister, but that's not the same thing by orders of magnitude as saying the Prime Minister is a dictator. And I think we can become overly comfortable with that kind of language. And we see it feeding into the kind of rhetoric that was on display during the Ottawa occupation, calling the Prime Minister a dictator, and opposition MPs from notably the Conservative Party, being pretty comfortable associating with some of those ideas. And that becomes really problematic if we're comfortable saying that the people we're talking to, that we're trying to amplify, are calling the Prime Minister a dictator and essentially calling for some kind of overthrow of democracy. And we see MPs from the Conservative Party using that kind of language even in the House of Commons. Again, it sort of legitimizes the idea that your opponents are not just wrong or mistaken, they are illegitimate. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around a while and it, participated in these political debates, and the elbows up in the corners, that's not uncommon, and tossing around labels is actually quite common, but it's not so much for politicians. Politicians have, in the past, in my recollection, been very careful about the language they use, and in the House, outside the House, in the media, in public meetings, they've been more careful, and that seems to have gone by in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe longer.
Yeah, it really does seem like this is an area where we've seen some concrete changes, where we see the opposition in particular willing to say that our opponents are not just mistaken, they are in some sense anti-democratic, and it's therefore opposing them is standing up not just for a particular view of how we should undertake policy, but is essentially standing up for democracy. We're going to try to fight these non-democratic agents, and that it tends to legitimize all kinds of activities, not unlike what we saw in Ottawa, if you take that tack repeatedly over time and start to legitimize it. And it's true, we have seen some excess of rhetoric on the part of other parties in the past as well. One of the instances I reference in the article was an instance, I think it was in 2007, when an NDP MP, Pat Martin, made a comparison between the Conservative Minister for Agriculture at the time and Il Duce. But the thing is, he got called out for it. The speaker at the time heard a complaint, there's a point of order raised, and found that to be unparliamentary language. And Martin apologized and withdrew the comment. And so we're not seeing that kind of a willingness to reconsider language when things get too hot here. Rather, we see a doubling down and saying, well, actually, when the Prime Minister is invoking an Emergencies Act to deal with the occupation of the capital city, that's evidence of dictatorship. But even though there's all kinds of ways in which that decision is still being held to account through legal means and ultimately through democratic means as well.
Now, I have to say, my impression as somebody who pays attention to politics, writes about it, and is engaged in on social media in political discussions, is that the conservative supporters, conservative politicians, are much more likely to engage in this kind of behavior, particularly the populist ones. And you mentioned Pierre Poilievre, who's the MP who's running for leadership of the CPC, as being one example. Am I off base, or is that your take as well?
And it seems like the comfort level with this kind of language is much higher on that side of the spectrum and in that particular faction as well. And I think it can be a little too easy to draw comparisons between what happens in the United States and what happens in Canada. But this does seem like this is one link that does have some merit, where we see supporters of Donald Trump willing to actually storm the Capitol building in 2021 to try to defend the presidency of Donald Trump, and essentially saying winning the election is more important than defending political institutions. That it's a similar kind of attitude when we start to endorse the idea that our opponents are anti-democratic, and therefore resistance by other means than, say, democratic ones is justified. And I think we see that above all in these more populist styles of conversation, and that is to some extent to be expected. Any kind of populist movement is going to be built around the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with the political system. But just because one is populist doesn't mean one is rejecting the democratic system. We had the Reform Party of a previous generation on the conservative side. It didn't say we needed to resist an anti-democratic leader. It rather said we need more democracy. We need to have things like recall elections for MPs. We need to have more referenda and so on. And we go back even further. We can go to the CCF on the left side of the spectrum. Again, a populist party, but not saying that we need to do away with anti-democratic leaders. We need new ideas, and we need new leaders, and we need a much more vigorous form of democracy. And so one can be populist without delegitimizing one's opponent as anti-democratic. And I think that's a line that it would be good to try to find ways to come back to as a country, because this can be a slippery slope where we cease to see one another as legitimate interlocutors.
What role might the social media play, especially the extremist web page or Facebook pages, those Twitter accounts, and conspiracy theories? I'm thinking of QAnon and some of the and Trump would be another one. There's a lot of that floating around out there in the populist side of the right of center. What role might that play in the sort of degradation of political language?
Well, it certainly plays a role. We have, we can talk about echo chamber effects, but we have essentially these ecosystems that exist online that allow certain kinds of political perspectives to be cared for and built upon, and never really exposed to some kind of countervailing discourse. And any but the most sort of gladiatorial ways. People show up on Twitter to yell at each other for a little while, and then they go back to their Facebook groups, and they go back to their little protected corners of the internet, where they hear the same messages reinforced without having any kind of need to reference some kind of basis for factual discussion. And so you end up with these parts of the internet where people will talk about the Prime Minister Trudeau is being dictatorial, even though he is going to be up for election, even though he's being called such in a heavily protected legislature, where people have a wide ability to speak their minds without fear of censure. And he's being called out for his policies, which is fine, but in ways that delegitimize him, which is not. And so this becomes a real challenge. How do you try to expose those excesses to the realities that the Prime Minister is being held to account democratically? People are challenging the actions of the federal government in a fiercely independent judicial system in Canada. So we have all kinds of checks on power that you could get in a discussion about. But when social media allows people to talk to those whom they want to talk to, who share their points of view, you don't really have that back and forth where people can come to a compromise position. And that is a big problem.
Well, Stewart, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.